The courtroom went quiet when the math finally landed. Not dramatic quiet, but the kind where nobody reaches for a pen anymore. Prosecutors stacked murder counts, firearm charges, racketeering enhancements, then read a number so high it stopped sounding real: 875 years. Nobody argued the total, since arguments stopped earlier after timelines aligned and patterns locked together. What mattered was how a case reached that point without starting as a case at all. This did not come from one loud mistake or one wild week. It built slowly, starting in a place that once felt harmless, familiar, almost protective, before control slipped from hands without anyone noticing the grip loosen. Before courtrooms, indictments, or headlines, Englewood moved on a rhythm that outsiders rarely understood, where mornings carried school traffic and afternoons folded into porch talk, corner stores, and short walks that everybody timed carefully. Violence existed, but it lived alongside routines, not above them, so kids still played ball near cracked pavement while older heads watched from cars, keeping mental notes. People knew which blocks needed respect, which hours required caution, and which faces meant no trouble, since survival depended on awareness rather than panic. That balance stayed fragile yet functional, letting ordinary life continue without pretending danger disappeared. Alex Vaughn and Alvin Vaughn grew up inside that rhythm, understanding early that attention mattered as much as reputation, which shaped how they moved through Englewood without aligning themselves with any set. They carried respect without colors, using personality, athletic skill, and relationships built over years, which earned them space others could not access safely. Basketball became their lane, not as charity or rescue, but as something consistent where people gathered without tension flaring. When they organized games, nobody checked affiliations first, since the court acted as neutral ground, protected by mutual interest rather than rules. That neutrality carried weight, functioning as quiet protection and social currency, since nobody wanted to disrupt something that kept kids busy and adults calm. The Vaughn brothers never claimed to save anybody, since they focused on routine, showing up, setting schedules, collecting teams, and keeping disputes away from the baseline. Their league stayed small but visible, drawing teenagers who wanted structure without signing into deeper obligations. Over time, the Goonies name stuck, playful at first, more about friendship than territory, which let it exist without immediate pressure from surrounding crews. Everything shifted emotionally in 2008, when Albert Vaughn, their younger brother, was killed while trying to break up a fight near home, turning grief into something permanent rather than loud. Albert was an honor student at Julian High School, respected for discipline and focus, so his death cut through Englewood sharply, leaving shock without immediate retaliation. Instead of turning outward, the Vaughn family pulled inward, pouring energy into keeping younger people busy and visible, hoping activity might reduce risk. The basketball league expanded quietly, becoming more organized without becoming militant, still rooted in familiarity. Through those years, the Goonies stayed open, trusted, and noticeable, hosting games around 71st Street and Aberdeen while maintaining distance from active beefs nearby. Their visibility became both strength and vulnerability, since everyone knew where they gathered and who belonged, creating transparency that felt safe at the time. Parents felt comfortable letting sons attend, and rivals respected the space without challenging it. Nobody considered how openness might attract attention from someone watching for opportunity rather than community. Romeo Blackman did not arrive with speeches, threats, or demands, since his entry came through presence rather than announcement, showing up regularly and blending into routines already established. He played his role well, following rules, respecting schedules, and matching energy, which made his attendance feel normal instead of strategic. People noticed consistency first, since familiarity breeds trust in spaces where unpredictability usually signals danger. Over time, his face stopped drawing questions, and his name circulated casually without alarm. Blackman did not push leadership immediately, since influence moved through small moments like organizing rides, handling disagreements, or speaking confidently during tense situations. When issues surfaced, he stayed calm, offered solutions, and projected certainty, which appealed in a neighborhood where hesitation often led to problems. Others deferred without realizing it, since delegation happened naturally, not through votes or confrontations. Authority shifted subtly, with people looking toward him during moments requiring direction. His appeal rested in structure, not kindness, since he framed decisions clearly and avoided wavering language, which resonated with younger members seeking stability. Confidence mattered in Englewood, especially when surrounding blocks carried constant pressure from active sets like Push Squad, Black Pea Stones, and other nearby crews. Blackman spoke like someone prepared, which made preparation feel necessary. Gradually, the Goonies stopped feeling like just a league and started feeling like something more organized, even if nobody said it aloud. Recruitment followed quietly, bringing in faces connected to Blackman rather than the Vaughn brothers, shifting the group's internal balance without open resistance. Names like DeMarco Bennett, Rashad Wells, Terrence Smith, and Jolicious Turman began appearing around games and gatherings, changing the energy without immediate confrontation. Their presence added edge, introducing street credibility that some found reassuring rather than threatening. The original mission blurred slightly, replaced by talk of loyalty, protection, and readiness. By the time people noticed leadership had changed, the change already felt permanent, since decisions passed through Blackman by default. The Vaughn brothers remained present, though influence slipped from hands accustomed to trust rather than control. Nobody challenged the shift openly, since harmony still existed on the surface. Control became assumed, not discussed, setting the stage for consequences that had not revealed themselves yet. The tension did not start with gunfire, since it began with Big John getting stopped, searched, booked, then walking back outside faster than people expected, carrying freedom that raised eyebrows immediately. Jonathan Johnson, known around the Goonies as Big John, caught a gun case in January 2014, a charge that usually landed somebody down longer. When he came home quickly, whispers spread without paperwork, since Englewood trained people to read outcomes rather than statutes. Nobody needed court transcripts to decide something felt off, especially inside a circle already learning to measure loyalty through suspicion. Romeo Blackman did not accuse Big John publicly, since public accusations forced answers, while quiet doubt gave room to act without explanation. Conversations shifted tone, with questions framed sideways, using hypotheticals, jokes, and long pauses that carried meaning without names. Rumors moved faster than facts, turning uncertainty into assumption through repetition and tone. Each retelling sharpened edges until doubt hardened into something people treated as settled truth. The killing happened indoors, not on a corner, which mattered since privacy suggested discipline rather than chaos. On January 22, 2014, inside a building near the 6900 block of South Racine, Big John walked into a hallway with someone he trusted. Shots followed quickly, contained, without witnesses, spilling onto the street, leaving a body discovered rather than a scene performed. Police later reported Jonathan Johnson, age 21, died from gunshot wounds, pronounced dead at the hospital shortly after. Inside the Goonies, nobody called it a murder out loud, since language shapes meaning and meaning shaped future behavior. It was framed quietly as a correction, something necessary to keep everyone safe, even if nobody asked, safe from what exactly? Silence filled the days afterward, with nobody checking on the family publicly or asking questions privately. That silence worked like approval, signaling that outcomes mattered more than explanations. Fear settled into the group without dramatic moments, changing how people spoke, laughed, and waited before answering questions. Where conversations once moved freely, they now paused, measured, then resumed carefully. Trust did not vanish instantly, but it thinned, replaced by alertness and internal ranking. People learned quickly which opinions stayed inside their heads. Alonzo Williams tested that new order without meaning to start a fight, since he spoke from familiarity rather than challenge. Known around Englewood as King Englewood, Alonzo carried respect for mediating disputes, organizing gatherings, and calming situations others avoided. He questioned what happened to Big John, not aggressively, but directly, which landed wrong at the wrong time. On March 21, 2014, Alonzo was shot and killed in an alley, his body found without ceremony. That second killing clarified everything without explanation, since patterns communicate faster than speech. If Big John's death raised doubts, Alonzo's death answered them, drawing a clear boundary around who could speak. Fear replaced trust fully, turning the Goonies inward, where survival depended on alignment rather than honesty. From that point forward, people listened more than they talked, watching leadership rather than participating in it. Englewood did not isolate the Goonies, since pressure pressed from every direction, with nearby factions watching changes closely. Push Squad operated blocks away, while Black P. Stones held territory across familiar streets, creating an environment where neutrality required constant maintenance. The Goonies had lived between those lines carefully, avoiding provocation while staying visible. After internal killings, that balance became unstable, since visibility now carried a different meaning. Territory started mattering differently, not as something claimed, but as something tested, with small movements drawing reactions. Cars slowed near known hangouts, unfamiliar faces lingered longer, and greetings felt measured rather than casual. The group responded by tightening their presence, staying together, and watching their surroundings with intent. Readiness became posture rather than a plan. The first outward projection came on October 23, 2014, when violence crossed from internal discipline into public action. Near 72nd Street, Stanley Bobo, an 18-year-old, was shot during a drive-by, struck in the abdomen. Another teenager was wounded, while witnesses described chaos rather than a targeted confrontation. Stanley later died at the hospital, his death marking the moment the Goonies entered wider conflict. That shooting locked the group into retaliation logic, where every incident demanded a response, regardless of intention or context. Readiness turned constant, with people expecting movement, scanning blocks, and preparing without specific targets. Planning was shortened, replaced by reaction, which accelerated mistakes. The environment shifted from cautious navigation to aggressive anticipation. Community perception changed immediately, since bystanders absorbed consequences without understanding motives. Parents stopped allowing kids near familiar courts, while store owners watched entrances more closely. The name Goonies, once tied to basketball, now carries unease, associated with unpredictability rather than safety. Word traveled quickly through Englewood, faster than any official statement. The Loomis Food Mart shooting in November 2014 sealed that perception permanently. Outside the store, Crystal Jackson, 25 years old, sat inside a car when gunfire erupted. Shots tore through the vehicle, killing her and wounding others nearby, turning a random stop into a fatal moment. Crystal worked at a daycare, carried plans unrelated to street conflict, which made her death resonate deeply. That moment shifted the Goonies from unpredictable to radioactive, since collateral damage removed any remaining tolerance. Neighbors who once ignored tensions now spoke openly about danger, sharing warnings and changing routines. Silence no longer protected the group since fear spread outward, drawing attention rather than deflecting it. The environment hardened against them. Inside the group, reaction gave way to pursuit since waiting invited pressure from all sides. Members stopped responding only when challenged, instead searching for contact, scanning rival spaces, and testing boundaries deliberately. Violence became proactive, framed as a necessity rather than an escalation. From that point forward, the Goonies no longer stumbled into conflict. They moved toward it intentionally, reshaping their identity completely. By late 2015, decision-making inside the Goonies no longer followed names, faces, or confirmed affiliations, since paranoia had replaced verification as the organizing principle. Movement itself became suspicious, especially when someone stood too long, parked awkwardly, or crossed familiar blocks without explanation. The group stopped asking who someone was connected to, focusing instead on what their presence suggested. That shift turned everyday behavior into a perceived threat, which shortened the distance between observation and violence. Andre Donner's killing reflected that drift clearly, since nothing about his posture or history suggested immediate danger. On December 13, 2015, Andre Donner, age 26, stood near 72nd Street in South May, a location already carrying tension from recent confrontations. Witnesses later described a silver Chrysler slowing near the corner before shots rang out. Donner was struck in the head, collapsing where he stood, then pronounced dead at the hospital less than an hour later. Inside the group, that killing was framed as a necessary positioning, even though no confirmed provocation existed. Donner lived in the area, knew people on multiple sides, and carried no known role in the Goonies' internal disputes. Still, proximity became enough, especially once fear trained eyes to see threat everywhere. The act reinforced the idea that hesitation created vulnerability while action created control. That logic hardened weeks later with David Horace's death, which showed how randomness stopped being accidental and became an accepted operating cost. On January 15, 2016, David Horace, 19 years old, sat inside a double-parked car on South May Street, waiting to pick someone up. He was not armed, not moving aggressively, and not involved in any immediate conflict. To the Goonies, his presence still registered as possible surveillance. Shots followed quickly, with witnesses finding Horace unresponsive inside his vehicle, suffering multiple gunshot wounds. He was transported to Stroger Hospital, where he died shortly afterward. The reasoning afterward did not center on identity, since identity mattered less than the moment. Mistaken identity stopped being discussed as an error, instead treated as an unavoidable risk that came with constant readiness. That approach reshaped how the group watched the neighborhood, since targeted beef gave way to wide lens surveillance. Members stopped tracking individuals, watching patterns instead, noting who appeared, who lingered, and who disappeared too quickly. Streets became grids rather than communities, with movement mapped loosely against memory. Surveillance turned casual, driven by intuition rather than intelligence. Enemies multiplied rapidly under that system, since every uncertain face carried potential meaning. Where loyalty once grew through shared experience, it now shrank under constant suspicion. People distanced themselves quietly, choosing absence over alignment, while those remaining stayed closer together out of necessity rather than trust. Fear became glue, holding the group together through shared risk rather than shared purpose. Inside that environment, cohesion depended on guilt more than belief, since participation bound members tighter than ideology ever had. Once someone crossed the line into action, leaving stopped being an option without consequence. Silence mattered more than agreement, and presence mattered more than trust. By early 2016, the Goonies functioned less like a crew and more like a closed loop, where survival depended on staying inside rather than stepping away. As conflict expanded, firearms became harder to source locally, forcing the group to rethink logistics beyond familiar blocks. Increased police presence, recent arrests, and heightened attention made street-level acquisition risky. The solution came through geography rather than innovation, pushing operations away from Chicago's grid and into quieter spaces downstate. That shift exposed the group to unfamiliar risks since rural movement carried different visibility. Straw purchases became the first adjustment, using individuals without records to acquire weapons legally. Gerald Bumper entered the picture there, connected through family rather than street ties, which made him valuable. Bumper lived outside Englewood, carried no known criminal history, and could move without immediate suspicion. For a time, he supplied firearms quietly, bridging a gap the group could not cross itself. That arrangement strained quickly, since demand increased faster than supply, creating pressure that money alone could not solve. When purchasing slowed, escalation followed out of necessity rather than ambition. In June 2016, members traveled to Spring Valley, Illinois, stealing a Jeep before driving to South Post Gunsmithing in Streator. They rammed the vehicle through the storefront, grabbing dozens of firearms within minutes. The burglary changed everything, since rural law enforcement responded differently from city police, triggering immediate federal attention. Surveillance footage, stolen vehicle reports, and firearm tracing connected dots faster than expected. The exposure forced the group into a defensive posture, increasing paranoia already present. Gerald Bumper shifted from asset to liability almost instantly. Rumors spread internally that Bumper might talk, not through evidence, but through fear shaped by recent losses. On June 30th, 2016, Gerald Bumper was found shot dead in a Southside alley, his body discovered days after the gun store burglary. Official records listed him among the homicide victims later tied to the Goonies racketeering case. Family connection offered no protection, showing boundaries had fully collapsed. That murder marked the point where personal ties no longer insulated anyone from consequence. Blood relations, once respected, now carry suspicion equal to any outsider. The group crossed into territory where necessity justified everything, even erasing its own connections. From that moment forward, nothing inside the Goonies existed untouched by fear, since survival outweighed loyalty completely. By the time summer 2016 arrived, violence no longer followed escalation patterns, since it moved with routine regularity, fitting into days already crowded with tension. What stood out was not chaos, but repetition, with shootings spaced close enough to feel scheduled rather than spontaneous. That rhythm mattered, since predictability attracts attention faster than shock. Each incident added data points, allowing patterns to form outside the neighborhood, even while residents struggled to keep up. Ramal Hicks became one of those data points without ever stepping into the conflict that surrounded him. On June 20th, 2016, Hicks, 34 years old, spent his evening delivering leftover food to homeless people across Englewood, something neighbors recognized him for regularly. Witnesses later described two men approaching him casually, asking questions, creating a moment that felt ordinary rather than threatening. When Hicks turned, he was shot in the head, collapsing where he stood, leaving no argument or warning. The response inside the neighborhood was immediate and heavy, since Hicks carried no street reputation, no visible alignment, and no history of conflict. Vigils formed quickly, with candles lining sidewalks and neighbors speaking openly about fear rather than loyalty. His death reframed the danger, shifting it from targeted violence to random loss. That shift mattered deeply, since randomness removes the illusion of control. Federal attention tightened after that killing, not due to emotion, but due to frequency. Investigators noted how close incidents were landing together, reducing the noise that usually obscures individual cases. The absence of a clear motive became its own signal, pointing toward organizational drift rather than isolated disputes. Hicks's death did not stand alone, since it arrived during a cluster that made coincidence impossible. 6 days later, on May 26, 2016, Gerald C.S. was killed at Powell's Barbershop on 63rd Street, a place locals treated as neutral ground. C.S., 45 years old, sat inside a barber chair, waiting for a haircut, carrying responsibilities unrelated to street politics. A shooter fired through the window, striking C.S. in the head, killing him instantly inside a space people trusted. The choice of location shattered assumptions about safe zones. That incident carried symbolic weight beyond the victim, since barbershops functioned as informal community centers across Englewood. Parents, workers, and elders crossed paths there without fear, which made the breach feel personal. Store owners nearby tightened routines, altering hours, adjusting sightlines, and watching entrances more closely. The killing sent a message unintentionally, showing that no boundary held anymore. From an investigative standpoint, the barbershop shooting offered clarity rather than confusion. Surveillance footage, eyewitness accounts, and location consistency helped narrow timelines quickly. Federal agencies noticed how violence now intersected with cameras, witnesses, and predictable movement. Each new incident reduced the margin for error that the group previously relied upon. The pattern continued into July when Kenneth Whitaker was killed near Stagg Elementary School on July 1, 2016. Whitaker, 34 years old, worked as a maintenance employee, walking home from his job that evening. He was shot in the head near school grounds, a detail that drew immediate response. The location amplified urgency, pulling additional resources into the case. Whitaker's death underscored how non-participants had become central casualties rather than unfortunate bystanders. He carried no known conflicts, no recent disputes, and no visible affiliations. His killing reinforced a trend already visible to analysts tracking the cases. Violence had shifted fully from targeted enforcement to broad intimidation through presence. Each death tightened the circle around the Goonies without needing dramatic intervention. Frequency created predictability, allowing investigators to anticipate movement, associate vehicles, and connect individuals across scenes. Ballistics linked shell casings, while phone data mapped proximity patterns. The randomness that once protected the group now exposed it. Inside Englewood, perception shifted decisively during that summer, with residents recognizing the group as a liability rather than a protector. Silence no longer shielded anyone, since danger moved indiscriminately. Even those previously aligned distanced themselves quietly, understanding the cost of association had risen beyond manageable levels. The Goonies, once tolerated, became something everyone wanted away from their block. Alex Vaughn did not wake up one morning planning to talk, since the decision formed slowly through accumulation rather than reversal. Years of watching something built for stability become a source of fear weighed heavily. Each funeral added pressure, while each threat narrowed options. The final stretch of summer 2016 left him exhausted rather than conflicted. Intimidation followed consistently, arriving through confrontations, messages, and warnings that never named consequences directly. Family members felt watched, routines altered, and familiar streets carried unfamiliar tension. Remaining silent no longer guaranteed safety, since danger no longer respected boundaries. That realization changed the calculation entirely. The breaking point came after another family loss, when Robert Vaughn was killed during the same violent stretch, collapsing remaining hesitation. Grief stripped away loyalty to a structure that no longer resembled its original purpose. Shortly afterward, Alex found himself arrested at a shooting range, a minor incident that placed him in custody unexpectedly. That moment forced reflection without distraction. Inside custody, Alex began organizing what he already knew, moving through names, dates, locations, and sequences. He had lived the transformation from inside, watching leadership shift, violence escalate, and boundaries dissolve. Documentation mattered, so he gathered screenshots from social media, videos, posts, and messages that others forgot existed. Those records carried timestamps that told a story independent of memory. When law enforcement engaged, the tone shifted from reactive questioning to structural listening. Investigators recognized the value of a timeline built from participation rather than speculation. Alex provided context that connected incidents previously treated separately. His cooperation allowed prosecutors to view the group as an enterprise rather than a collection of crimes. Screenshots showed members boasting after killings, while videos placed faces near vehicles tied to shootings. Messages revealed planning language and acknowledgement of outcomes. The material transformed narrative into evidence, allowing federal agencies to step in decisively. The case shifted from local enforcement to federal structure. Indictments landed together in October 2018, collapsing years of activity into paperwork filed simultaneously. Romeo Blackman, Terrence Smith, Julius Turman, and others faced racketeering charges tied to 9 murders, attempted murders, and firearm offenses. The suddenness of the filing contrasted sharply with the slow buildup behind it. Years of fear, silence, and loss condensed into formal counts read aloud without emotion. For Englewood, that moment marked the closure of one chapter without resolving the damage left behind. The silence that once protected the group finally broke, not through force, but through exhaustion. What followed belonged to courts rather than streets, as consequences shifted from rumor to record. Sentencing did not arrive with drama, since most outcomes were already understood long before the judge spoke. When the court finally returned to the numbers, nobody reacted outwardly, since the scale had stopped feeling human weeks earlier. The total sentence, 875 years, was not meant to be served literally, but meant to remove time from relevance altogether. Federal prosecutors stacked counts intentionally, layering murder convictions, firearm enhancements, and racketeering findings into something irreversible. The goal was not shock, but permanence, making sure release never entered future conversations. Romeo Blackman received the heaviest weight, convicted on racketeering conspiracy tied directly to multiple murders, attempted murders, and gun crimes committed between 2014 and 2016. Terrence Smith and Julius Turman followed with life-level sentences tied to specific killings, including Ramal Hicks, Gerald Sears, and Kenneth Whitaker. Other defendants received long federal terms for firearms trafficking and conspiracy, closing every operational door the group once used. Death was never sought, not from mercy, but from certainty, since life sentences already guaranteed permanent removal without appeals centered on capital punishment. The symbolism of stacked time mattered more than the total, since each year represented a separate decision, not a single mistake. Courts treated every killing as its own action, its own moment, its own consequence, refusing to let them blur together. That structure forced the record to reflect sequence rather than collapse everything into one label. In doing so, the sentence preserved accountability across the entire timeline, locking every step into permanent history. Rumors surfaced immediately, as they always do, suggesting cooperation deals, witness protection, or secret arrangements that never existed in the record. None of those claims held weight, since sentencing documents, court transcripts, and federal custody status remain public and unchanged. The myth of shortcuts often grows around long sentences, especially when numbers stop sounding real. In this case, the paperwork told a simpler story than the internet ever would. What mattered more than rumors was the silence afterward, since violence did not continue once the structure collapsed. Without leadership, the Goonies fragmented quickly, with remaining associates drifting away or folding into other groups quietly. Law enforcement attention shifted elsewhere, following patterns rather than names, while Inglewood absorbed the absence slowly. The fear did not disappear overnight, but the pressure eased. Back near 71st Street and Aberdeen, the original basketball court still exists, worn down but standing, surrounded by fewer voices than before. Kids still show up sometimes, though schedules stay shorter and supervision tighter. The Vaughn name still carries weight there, tied more to loss than legacy. Englewood did not return to what it was, but it moved forward without the constant tension that once filled every hour. The story ends there, not with resolution, but with space, since space itself had been missing for years. What happened did not erase damage, restore trust, or replace the people lost along the way. It only stopped something that had already gone too far. In Englewood, that was enough to change everything, even if nothing ever fully went back.